Hollywood gave us a version of the Old West that smelled like whiskey, gunpowder, and fresh pine. But the truth? The Wild West stank. And not just a little. We're talking eye-watering, stomach-churning, make-you-question-life-level bad. You think dysentery was the worst part of frontier life? Think again. Try sharing a cabin with 6 people, a dying mule, no windows, and a bucket that doubled as both toilet and soup pot. Yeah. In towns with no plumbing, no deodorant, and no shame, stench wasn't an accident. It was the background noise of existence. It soaked into your clothes, your boots, your beard, and probably your soul. And here's the kicker. People were used to it. So when something really smelled bad, even they noticed. At Beyond the Wild West, we're lifting the lid on history's least glamorous realities. So take a deep breath, or maybe don't, and let's count down 10 things that smelled worse than death itself in the Old West. Trust us, you'll never look at a campfire the same way again. Top 1. Chamber pots and outhouses. A toilet was just a hole. If you were lucky. When nature called in the Old West, you didn't answer it in comfort, you answered it in terror. Forget flushing toilets or even privacy. For most folks on the frontier, a bathroom was a wooden box over a pit. Or worse, a tin pot under the bed. Welcome to the glamorous world of outhouses and chamber pots. Outhouses were rarely cleaned, barely covered, and often shared by entire towns. No running water, no ventilation. Just a plank, a hole, and the growing scent of everyone who came before you. In the summer, the heat cooked everything. In the winter, your breath froze, but the stink didn't. And heaven help you if you fell in. Yes, it happened. But chamber pots were somehow worse. At night, too cold or dangerous to walk outside, people used ceramic bowls beside their beds. By morning, the pot was full of everything you didn't want to think about, and someone, usually the youngest or the wife, had to carry it outside and dump it. In cities, it was tossed into the streets, in camps, into bushes, and in both, right back into the drinking water sooner or later. The smell? Rancid, sour, human, a blend of shame, desperation, and very bad choices. And here's the kicker. If you were rich, you had a fancier pot, still full of poop, just with nicer patterns on it. So while movies show rugged cowboys riding tall in the saddle, they don't show what happened when those cowboys needed to go. Spoiler, it was disgusting. Top 2. Dead livestock left to rot. 1,000 pounds of pure decay. In the Old West, if your horse, cow, or mule died, well, sorry, partner. There were no animal disposal services. Most of the time, the body just stayed where it fell. And it stank. When a cow dropped dead, whether from disease, dehydration, snake bite, or old age, there was usually no time, energy, or manpower to bury it. The prairie was big, and death was frequent. So ranchers dragged the carcass out to the edge of the property and left it. And in the dry heat of the American West, that meant one thing: rot. Slow, bloated, fly-covered, bone-splitting rot. The smell? A mix of warm blood, bloating organs, and the kind of sweetness that makes your stomach churn. The kind of scent that sticks to your clothes, your horse, your soul. Even worse, some ranchers tried to salvage the hide or meat from recent deaths, which meant cutting open animals that had been dead for hours, maybe days. If you've never smelled a ruptured cow belly in the sun, good. Stay that way. Coyotes and vultures would circle for days, picking at the meat while the wind carried the scent for miles. Sometimes, whole camps would relocate just to get upwind of a dead bull. And this wasn't a one-time thing. This was every drought, every harsh winter, every outbreak of disease. So the next time you pass a steakhouse with a whiff of sizzling beef, just know, out on the frontier, beef smelled a lot more like death than dinner. Top 3. boots full of feet, gangrene and foot rot from months on the trail. You think athlete's foot is bad? Try marching 200 miles in wet boots with no socks, no soap, and no time to take them off. That wasn't just gross in the Old West, it was deadly. Cowboys, soldiers, and settlers spent weeks, sometimes months, on the trail. Through rivers, snow, mud, and heat. And their boots, they stayed on. Not because they liked it, but because taking them off could mean never getting them back on. Feet would swell, skin would blister, and infections would set in fast. The result? Rotting flesh, weeping sores, toes blackening with gangrene, and worst of all, no one did anything about it, because out on the range, there weren't doctors, just a knife, a bottle of whiskey, and a prayer that your foot didn't fall off before the next town. There are stories of men removing their boots only to pull out part of their foot with them. Fungus and bacteria thrived in the sweaty, enclosed heat. Some folks kept gunpowder or tobacco in their socks, believing it dried things out. Spoiler, it didn't. And the smell? Think dead meat soaked in swamp water, left in the sun, then sealed in leather. So, yeah, people wore their boots proud in the Old West. But sometimes, there wasn't much left inside them, but pain, pus, and a few blackened toes. Top 4. Unwashed surgical tools. 1 operation, 3 smells, sterilization. That wasn't a word in the Old West. Neither was hygiene. So when it came to surgery, whether you were losing a leg, removing a bullet, or just unlucky enough to get a tooth pulled, you were in for a medical nightmare that hit all the senses, and none harder than your nose. Doctors, or whoever had the steadiest hands in town, reused their tools constantly. A bone saw from yesterday's amputation, still sticky, still sharp, still good enough. Needles, scalpels, and clamps were often wiped on aprons, already soaked in blood, or rinsed in whiskey if you were lucky. If not, straight from one wound into the next. What did that smell like? Imagine a hot iron skillet full of sweat, rot, dried blood, and something that might have once been beef, but isn't anymore. Add the stench of fear, sweat, open flesh, and sometimes the unmistakable sweetness of infection. And congratulations, you're now nose deep in a frontier operating room. Oh, and anesthesia? Usually just a bottle of liquor and someone to hold you down. If you screamed, nobody blamed you. If you passed out, they kept cutting. If you lived, they probably used the same saw on the next guy. So when they said frontier medicine saved lives, they meant 1 out of 3. The rest? They died smelling rust, rot, and regret. Top 5. Rancid meat and spoiled provisions, when the buffalo jerky fought back. If the smell didn't kill you, the bacteria probably would. In the Old West, refrigeration was a fantasy, ice was a luxury, and expiration dates were just a suggestion, if anyone knew what those were. So when it came to storing meat, settlers and cowboys relied on salting, drying, and hoping for the best. Sometimes it worked. Other times, the jerky bit back. Provisions were packed months in advance, hauled across deserts, mountains, and rivers in wagons that shook every crumb loose. That buffalo jerky you brought from Kansas? By the time you reached Colorado, it was sun-baked, sweat-soaked, and maybe home to a few adventurous maggots. Salted pork often turned yellow and slick with mold. Dried fish could reek of rot if it got damp just once. Even beans, if stored in the wrong barrel, could sour and ferment. But food was food. And in the West, you didn't waste a scrap, even if it twitched. The smell of spoiled provisions was legendary, a mix of rot, mildew, and that sharp, greasy tang of meat that's just off. Whole camps were abandoned because the food stores turned. In mining towns, vomiting was so common it had its own nickname: provision poisoning. And if you were lucky, you just got diarrhea. So next time you complain about gas station jerky or a funky fridge smell, remember, on the frontier, dinner didn't just smell dead, it sometimes tried to come back to life. Top 6. Open wounds and field. Hospitals. No soap, just screaming. The smell hit before the pain did. That's how you knew you were close. Imagine walking into a tent with blood-soaked rags, rusty tools, and a surgeon wiping his hands on his pants before saying, "Next." That wasn't a nightmare. That was the average field hospital during the Old West, especially during wars, raids, or railroad accidents. Antiseptics? Nope. Anesthesia? If you were lucky, hygiene? Don't even ask. Field hospitals weren't sterile zones. They were blood pits, straw floors soaked in pus, sweat, and old whiskey. Surgeons moved from one patient to the next with the same blade. The smell of infection clung to everything. Gangrene, abscesses, and the sour-sweet rot of dying flesh. If a limb had to come off, they did it fast. The only thing faster? The stench that followed. Open wounds were rarely cleaned properly. Bandages weren't changed, just added on top. And since water was limited, most sanitation came from whiskey, poured more often into the patient than onto the tools. And the worst part? Screams were constant. The smell wasn't just of blood, it was terror, pain, and death, mixed into the air like smoke you couldn't escape. Doctors back then weren't healers. They were butchers with belts and good intentions. And if the wound didn't kill you, the infection probably did. So if you think modern hospitals smell bad, remember, back then, the scent of a field hospital meant one thing. You probably weren't walking out. Top 7. Cowboy socks never washed. The real silent weapon of the trail. If your boots didn't make you miserable, your socks sure would. Out on the trail, a cowboy's life was full of dirt, dust, and sweat. But nothing was quite as unbearable as his socks. Unlike today, where we can throw socks in the laundry at the end of the day, cowboys wore their socks until they practically disintegrated and washed them only when it became absolutely necessary. For months on end, the same pair of socks would hug their feet, collecting sweat, dirt, and the unmistakable smell of neglect. As the cowboys trekked across the wilderness, the condition of their feet deteriorated. With little access to fresh water, their socks would begin to smell rancid from sweat, grime, and the thick layers of dirt that built up from weeks of walking. The natural odor of a pair of well-worn socks, especially in hot, dusty weather, was bad enough. But the true horror came from what was growing in those socks. Often, the constant moisture trapped by these unwashed socks led to fungal infections, athlete's foot, and even trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp conditions. And in the absence of proper footwear and hygiene, cowboys' feet became breeding grounds for bacteria, causing a smell that could make the toughest men gag. But the real kicker? Those socks never got any better. No matter how many rivers they crossed, no matter how many times they dunked their feet in streams, the socks remained thick with filth. To the point that if you were lucky enough to be riding in the same wagon as a cowboy, you'd wish you weren't. It was so bad that when other trailmates caught a whiff of their socks, they'd avoid them for days. This powerful stench could knock out even the toughest cowboy, rendering him more of a liability than an asset. So, next time you imagine a cowboy trudging across the plains with their boots on, just remember, their socks were the real silent weapon, and they were never, ever clean. Top 8. Mass graves after epidemics, buried shallow, smelled deep. When death swept through the frontier, it wasn't just the bodies that piled up, the smell did too. Epidemics were one of the Old West's deadliest forces. With no modern medicine or vaccines to stop the spread of disease, entire towns could fall to outbreaks in a matter of weeks. Diseases like cholera, Smallpox and tuberculosis ravaged the frontier, leaving a wake of mass graves that became the final resting places for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of victims. But these graves weren't always well tended. In the haste to bury the dead and prevent further spread of illness, bodies were often buried hastily, in shallow graves and without proper preparation. Sometimes, the very people digging the graves were also the ones struck down by the disease. The result? A grotesque and stifling stench that hung over these burial sites long after the bodies had been laid to rest. In towns where cholera broke out, entire families were wiped out, with neighbors digging mass graves just to get rid of the bodies quickly. There were no coffins, no markers, no time to mourn. The dead were dumped hastily into shallow pits, and because they weren't deep enough or properly sealed, the smell of decay would seep out and linger in the air for weeks. As bodies decomposed in the hot, dry soil, the smell of death was inescapable. Imagine walking through a frontier town and smelling the lingering stench of hundreds of people buried too close to the surface. In such conditions, disease wasn't the only enemy. The air itself seemed to turn against you, heavy with the scent of decay and desperation. For survivors, it was a constant reminder of the fragile line between life and death on the frontier. No one was safe from the plagues, and even the land couldn't forget those who had been lost. The stench from those mass graves would serve as a cruel and ever-present reminder of the ravages of disease and the struggles of the people who fought to survive amidst it all. Top 9. Saloons on a hot day. Sweat, spit, smoke, and something worse. When the heat hit the West, the saloons didn't just sweat, it stank. On a sweltering summer day in the Old West, the saloon wasn't just a place to grab a drink. It was where the dust of the desert clung to your clothes. The scent of sweat filled the air, and the ever-present smoke from cigars and pipes mixed with the smells of spilled liquor and unwashed bodies. These saloons were hubs of social life, but they were far from glamorous, and they sure weren't clean. The moment you stepped through the swinging doors, the heat hit you like a wall. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of sweat, tobacco smoke, and the sharp tang of alcohol. Patrons spent hours huddled around the bar, sipping whiskey or playing cards, and it didn't take long before their sweat-soaked clothes left a noticeable odor in the air. Add to that the dusty trail dirt brought in with every new customer, and you had a cocktail of unpleasant smells that only intensified as the day wore on. But it wasn't just the people who contributed to the stink. In the absence of regular cleaning, and often basic hygiene, the saloon floors were caked in grime, spittle from chewing tobacco, and old beer stains. Spittoons sat in every corner, filled with the thick brown juice of tobacco-chewing patrons, adding an extra layer of unpleasantness to the already pungent atmosphere. On top of that, the saloon windows were usually left shut against the dust and the heat, creating a suffocating atmosphere that was only relieved when the doors were kicked open in a dramatic showdown or the occasional brawl. The entire space was often stuffy and claustrophobic, filled with loud arguments, rowdy laughter, and the unmistakable smell of a place that had seen its fair share of fights, drunkenness, and human drama. It wasn't uncommon for a saloon to be the site of some truly unsavory events. Broken glasses, spilled drinks, and fights over women or poker games. After a long day under the desert sun, the saloon was a place to unwind, but not without enduring the smells that came with a hard life lived under intense conditions. A place of comfort? Maybe, if you could stomach the air. For those brave or foolish enough to spend hours inside, surviving the heat and the smells was simply part of the experience, and on days when the temperature soared, that suffocating, stinking atmosphere became the backdrop to many a wild tale of drunken mischief and bold confrontations. Top 10. Goat pens behind the church. Where sin wasn't the only thing that stank. The church was supposed to be a refuge. The goat pen? Not so much. In the Old West, churches were central to many frontier communities, providing spiritual guidance, a sense of unity, and a much-needed break from the harshness of frontier life. But not every church had the serene, holy atmosphere you might expect. For some, the sacred was mingled with the stench of something far less divine. The goat pens that often sat directly behind the church. Goats were common on the frontier. They were hardy animals, able to thrive in the tough conditions of the West, providing milk, meat, and even leather for those in isolated homesteads. In small frontier towns, space was tight, and practicality trumped cleanliness. Churches, which often doubled as community gathering spots, became the perfect place to keep goats, at least during the colder months when grazing was harder to come by. But it wasn't just the smell of animals that made the area behind the church so notorious. Goat pens were a breeding ground for foul odors. The pungent smell of animal urine and manure permeated the air. In these pens, goats were kept in tight, often unsanitary conditions, with hay and food scraps scattered on the ground, attracting flies and rodents. As the animals ate and lived in such close quarters, the smell became unbearable, especially during the hotter months when the heat amplified every scent. The heat caused the manure to dry quickly, releasing a sharper, almost acrid scent that mixed with the rank odor of old straw and spilled milk. But the worst part? The goats didn't care about the smell. They had a job to do, provide food and milk, and sometimes act as a reminder that even in sacred spaces, life was messy. The sound of goats bleating echoed in the background as people prayed, their holy vows mingling with the bleating of goats in desperate need of food, water, or attention. This scene of rural practicality next to the house of God was a stark reminder of the ruggedness of life on the frontier. It was a place where even the most sacred places had to deal with the realities of survival. And for those attending Sunday services or visiting for a prayer meeting, the smell of goats was just part of the package. It wasn't uncommon for churchgoers to hold their noses as they passed the goat pen, especially in the summer months when the scent was at its strongest. As hard as it was to ignore, it was part of frontier life, where the sacred and the stinky often came together. So next time you think of a peaceful church behind a hill, remember the reality for some Old West townsfolk. The only thing more pungent than the goats? Perhaps the sins they were supposedly being cleansed of. As we close the chapter on the strange and stinky side of the Old West, it's clear that life in this rugged frontier wasn't just about gunfights and saloon brawls. It was about survival, resilience, and sometimes the unbearable realities of day-to-day life. From rotting provisions to the stench of goat pens behind churches, the Old West was a place where things often got messy. Literally. While history tends to romanticize the wild frontier, the truth is far less glamorous. The smell of sweat, livestock, and the rawness of nature filled the air, much like it still does in some rural areas today. The pioneers, settlers, and cowboys who lived and worked in these conditions didn't have the luxury of pristine cleanliness or modern comforts. They dealt with whatever the land and life threw at them. If you found yourself on the frontier, you learned to live with the stink, because in the end, it was the price you paid for freedom. It wasn't pretty, but it sure was real. And with that, we say goodbye for now. If these stories from the Old West left you itching for more strange tales, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and join us again for more untold stories from beyond the Wild West. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the West wasn't just wild. It was a lot smellier than you ever imagined.